what they've done, and if you go back to the beginning of the environmental movement, of the modern environmental movement in the 1960s, they've used every environmental scare, from overpopulation to resource scarcity to threat of famine to deforestation to global cooling, as an excuse to increase the regulatory powers of the state. In other words, we're facing overpopulation, we're facing global cooling. We need to redistribute wealth. We need sovereignty limiting treaties. We need more central planning. We need less freedom, less capitalism. I actually point that out in my book. So the motivating factor between climate change and what's going on today is global warming is merely the latest environmental scare with the exact same solutions going back 50 years. In other words, it doesn't really matter what the science of global warming. They actually have quotes. Their main figures say that. The EU climate commissioner said, even if we're wrong on the science, we're doing the right thing by policy. What is that policy? The UN climate chief explicitly stated, and I interviewed her on this, we seek a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different for everyone. That's the UN climate chief's explicit goal. Her talking about it. They talk about global governance. They talk about CO2 budgets for every man, woman, and child on the planet. This is their goal, and global warming is merely the latest scare. You can go back, and I do go back in the book. Global cooling had the exact same solutions. It's always the intervention and the increasing the power of the regulatory state. That is why we're hearing about global warming. We're not hearing about global warming because of temperature or storms or polar bears. It's because they're seeking a justification. They don't want to argue on the merits their policies. In other words, the Green New Deal, they just admitted, IOC's chief of staff said this was never about the climate. This was a increase the government kind of thing, a change the whole economy type of thing. Her former chief of staff, campaign manager, actually said a similar thing, that this was actually not about the climate. They're openly admitting that. They don't want to argue their points on the merit. Instead, it's a way to transform the economy, massive wealth redistribution, massive central planning, with literally bean counters affecting every aspect of your life. And they've been intimidated.
There's another thing I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned this in your book, and that is how some scientists focus on reducing the population, the human race. It's a very radical thing. And I wonder if you see a connection between the radical push to reduce the population on Earth and Planned Parenthood's agenda to basically kill unborn children.
Yes, and the aforementioned interview, Al Gore at a Bill Gates event said, Africa's gonna have too many people, we need fertility management. That's where Planned Parenthood comes in. They're great at fertility management, code words. When you have the population scare like we have now, we have advisors to Pope Francis who believe that the carrying capacity of the Earth is only about 1 billion people. In other words, let's wipe out 6-7 billion people because the Earth can't handle any more than that. And these are people that have gone to the Vatican. I went to a Vatican climate summit and I was threatened to be removed by United Nations security. It was a papal meeting at the Vatican with UN officials, where basically the Vatican married itself to the UN climate agenda. And at this agenda, they had some of the biggest promoters, Planned Parenthood, population control, people like Jeffrey Sachs. I called it an unholy alliance with what Pope Francis did. And it's sad because these advisors, these people were given great credibility. They're tied in with the United Nations. This is behind the agenda. When you look at the developing world, one of their goals is to limit their population. These poor countries where people are using animal plows for agriculture, they're doing it right because they're farming and they're cultivating the earth. Meanwhile, they're living in huts of dung. They're breathing in all the soot and horrible air quality from that. They're polluting their rivers with feces. They have no infrastructure. They have no sewage, modern sanitation, no hospitals, no modern dentistry, high infant mortality. In my sequel, I'm actually interviewing, but I'm featuring the MTV show Trippin' with Drew Barrymore and a couple other actresses who go to these third world hellholes, and that's a politically incorrect term now. You're supposed to say the developing world. And they praise these countries for being earth-friendly and for not having development. Well, I did an analysis and showed that the highest infant mortality rates were in the countries they were promoting. This is their agenda. They actually believe that keeping people at a subsistence level is moral, and it's a great way to go forward. And that's what the policies are designed to do. President Obama, his legacies was preventing modern energy coal plants being built in Africa, which would have brought running water, electricity to over 1 billion people throughout the world.
When they don't seem...
What's the motive? Well, this is a guy by the name of Robert Malthus. And he was the son of an aristocrat, and of course he was the third son, so he had to go into the church, became a minister of the church. The eldest son took over the property, the estate. The second son went into the army, and the third son went into the ministry. So they had places to put their children. And Malthus got interested in population, and he wrote a book called An Essay on the Principles of Population. Darwin took this book with him on the Beagle when he went on his famous voyage of discovery of evolution. You know what Malthus's view was? There are too many people. We got to reduce the number of people. And the governments are not helping because the governments are giving out money to the poor. Right? They're helping the poor. They're helping those people that shouldn't be having children. Okay? So Malthus was really a eugenicist. Got to reduce the population. And what he argued was that the population would outgrow the food supply. That idea got picked up by this guy, Paul Erlich, at Stanford University. Yeah, okay, and he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And published, and here you see some of his predictions. The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve, including Americans. I think you got the other end of the problem, don't you? I wouldn't be a judgmental Canadian and make any comment about that. But yeah. So here you see, smog disasters, 1973 might kill 200,000 people in New York and Los Angeles. Yeah, thin the herd. I like that. That's a good name. I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. This guy's still teaching at the university. I mean, it's unbelievable that you can be that wrong. And then he said, before 1985, mankind will enter a genuine age of scarcity in which the accessible supplies of many key minerals will be facing depletion. An economist by the name of Julian Simon took a bet with him. And he said, I'll bet you pick any minerals and you pick any time period, and I'll bet you by the end of it there'll be more minerals at a lower price. And Erlich took the bet. But he hired somebody to pick the minerals in the time period. And he picked this guy, John Holdren, who is now Obama's science czar. Okay? And Holdren wrote a book with Paul Erlich called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment. And here's one of the things he says in the book. Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution. So how could that be? But here's the game. Here's the game. Many years ago, H.L. Mencken, who I used to think was far too cynical, but as I get older, I realize was very wise. H.L. Mencken said that the urge to save the planet is almost always a false front for the urge to rule. Yes. Okay? And in order to justify doing what under normal circumstances people would say, you can't do that. Forced abortions? What kind of a state do you think we're living in? But look what he says. Under the existing, if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger society, oh, we're doing this for the greater good. Oh, we're taking over your land for the greater good. We're taking over your water resources for the greater good. We're saving the planet. You don't care about the planet or the children? What kind of a monster are you? See, that's the moral high ground they take. That's the way it's played. So you've got to look at, how do they justify this? And there you see it. Holdren, by the way, was a promoter of eugenics, the idea that you select certain people. And then that got put into the Club of Rome, which was founded by David Rockefeller in 1961. And these guys, King and Schneider, said the common enemy of humanity is man. There's that theme we talked about earlier. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming. See, they needed something that was going to impact the whole Earth. Because then they could say, hey, individual nations aren't capable of dealing with this. It's got to be one world government. got to be a total world government. That's the only way we can handle this. It's a threat to the whole of the planet. That's the game that's going on here. The Club of Rome got, by the way, into the Agenda 21. We'll get to that in a minute. But here's the interesting thing. This goes back to about early 60s at least. This is called the demographic transition model. What it shows is that as your economy improves, your population declines. Okay? Why? Why did people have a lot of children in the old days? Because that was their pension plan. And they had lots of children because if 3 out of 10 survived, you were lucky. I advise you all to read a book called The Weaker Vessel, which was the lot of English women in the 15th and 16th century. And when I tell you that Queen Anne had 19 children, and she outlived all of them, only one of them lived to the age of 7. These are conditions we can't even relate to Africa today. The average woman in the 17th century had 23 confinements, that is 23 pregnancies. And what they did was, the child was, the second it was born, it was baptized because they didn't want it to die with original sin. They baptized it and said, well, this child is Elizabeth. And then if Elizabeth died, the next girl that was born was called Elizabeth. They kept using the name till the child lived. We don't even relate to those things. You don't understand what history was like and what it was all about. And by the way, Antonia Fraser wrote about that in a book called The Weaker Vessel, which was the description of women in the 15th and 16th century. But the demographic transition shows that if you allow economic development, the population goes down. And in fact, in those countries that are not allowing immigration, they've got serious problems. Because if you go to Japan, you normally need 2.6 children per family. Okay, I was the 0.6 in my family. You've already figured that out, haven't you? But if you have below 2.6 children per family, then your population rate's going to decline. Japan is about 1.3. And what they've got now is an aging population because people are living longer and in better health, and you've got a smaller and smaller young people to support that. Many countries, Russia, they're paying white Russians to have a third child. Italy's paying couples to have a third child. Province of Quebec is paying French Canadians to have a third child. See how political it becomes. Okay, well, we decide which ones we want, which we don't want. Japan is one of the most racist nations on the planet. Doesn't allow immigration. You see that Aoki, the golfer, who's Japanese, he's actually third generation Korean. But they won't allow him to be a Japanese citizen. And so, as I say, when you allow proper development, it's a situation in the US. Amongst your American population generally, the birth rate's going down. It's being offset by immigration. Right? You're creating this, oh, we need them for the jobs, to do the jobs. Now you know why. So this demographic transition actually is the solution. So you allow development, you don't block development. This is Maurice Strong, a Canadian, who it was interviewed, and he said, isn't the only hope for the planet the industrialized nations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? He's a member of the Club of Rome. Okay, a very good friend of the Canadian Prime Minister. And he started all of this. He took it from the Club of Rome and put it into the United Nations. How would you do this? How would you bring about the end of the industrialized nations? Well, if you think about the industrialized nation driven by fossil fuel like the engine of a car, you can stop the engine of the car by squeezing off the fuel line. But if you do that, people scream right away. You've experienced that. The price of gasoline goes up, everybody's in a riot. Right? But you can also stop the engine by plugging the exhaust. So if you could tell people, hey, the exhaust from your engine or your industrialized nation is causing runaway global warming, and we've got to stop it. And what is the exhaust from that fossil fuel engine? CO2. So now we come full cycle around. Why did they choose CO2? Because it wanted to fulfill this. Got to shut down the industrialized nations. And of course you see that's what Obama's doing. The coal plants and all the rest of it. And if you want to see the effects of what happens when you institute those policies, In the same year that he chaired the Rio Summit in 1992, he became the head of Ontario Hydro, which is the public utility in Ontario, Canada, that controls all energy in that province. And he shut down the nuclear plants, he shut down the coal plants, and he built wind turbines. And ever since, Ontarians have been paying a surcharge on their electricity bills. And they'll be paying it for 40 years as they attempt to catch up with the damage that he did. But he wants that for the whole world. That's what he wants for the whole world. And so this guy, I mean, he's got a lot to answer for. By the way, when Elaine Dewar, who interviewed him for her book, said, well, that's a good idea, why don't you run for politics? Oh, he said, you can't do anything as a politician. I'm going to the United Nations where I can get all the money I want, not be accountable to anybody. But he's become accountable. Do you know where he is now? He's hiding out in China, where he's saying China's the greatest country in the world. Right? Yeah, great, if you can live there on your billions. Do you know why he's hiding out in China? Because the US government want him for fraud. Because he and his son, Kofi Annan, who was the head of the United Nations, and his son, made millions of dollars off of that food for oil in Iraq scam. And we've actually got photographs of a South Korean businessman with $1 million check being handed over on this deal. So and by the way, I should tell you, there's a Canadian by the name of Conrad Black who was put in jail in Florida. He's now out. He never did anything illegal, but he never ever in his life did anything that was moral or ethical. But he gave the game away because they said, why aren't you in politics? He said, I don't need to be. That's one of those statements that's just a sleeper, isn't it? The more you think, I don't need to be. In other words, I can get everything I want, do whatever I want, not be accountable to anybody. And so, unfortunately, that's the sad truth. And here's what Elaine Dewar, and I spoke to Elaine 5 years ago, said you should redo the book. She said, I got hate mail, I got death threats, I wouldn't go near it. Worst thing I ever did. She said, Strong was using the United Nations as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. So that's what he did. And that's what you're suffering under now. In the United States, this is Senator Tim Wirth. He was the guy that put this on the political table because he wanted a scientist that would say that humans were causing the global warming. And he found a guy by the name of James Hansen who was working for NASA. And Hansen said, yeah, I'll come before your committee and I'll say that. It's not possibly true, but yeah, he said, I'll say that. He was rewarded by being made head of NASA GIS for the rest of his career. Okay? While he was a senior bureaucrat, was protesting before the White House, which completely defies your Hatch Act, which limits the political activity of senior bureaucrats. While he was the head of NASA GIS, he flew to Britain and defended 4 Greenpeace people who had bombed a coal plant. And they got off on the grounds that here was this senior American scientist saying that what they were doing was justified. But what happened with Wirth? He said, well, we got to get this Hansen to appear before a Senate committee. And so they set it up, and this is the level of corruption. And you can Google this on Frontline, PBS Frontline, Wirth's interview. They figured out which was the hottest day of the year in Washington from the record, June the 6th. And they said, okay, that's the day we'll have we'll have Hansen in to talk about global warming and the heat, the runaway heat. But the night before, they went into the Senate and they opened the windows and shut off the air conditioning. So the whole thing was held in sweltering heat. And of course, what better ambiance to make your argument about global warming? That's this man. Guess where he's working now? Gave up a nice Senate seat. He's now with the United Nations. Okay?